Welcome back, everyone, to Israel Matters. I'm Rabbi Pesach Wolicki, and I'm here once again with security, defense, history expert, and of course, coffee and fine meat and wine expert, Elliot Chodoff. How are you doing, Elliot?
I'm good, Pesach. How are you?
Good. But later on, we have to have a conversation about proper marinades for steaks.
Oh,
I'm
yes.
sure you have some ideas.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to start just with two quick thoughts. One of them is the fact that in this deal with the Emirates that we were talking about last time, I'm not going to really talk about this much today, but there was obviously the backing off of the annexation. And it got me thinking about the whole topic of the nations of the world in all the negotiations with Israel since even before the state, very interested in dividing up the land and other people laying claim, other nations or other groups of people laying claim to pieces of the land of Israel. And it seems to be very important to many of the nations of the world that this or that portion of the land of Israel and even the city of Jerusalem be chopped up and divided up. And a few weeks back, I shared an interesting verse that was kind of a cryptic verse for many centuries, but to us is simple, about actually there being a division of Jerusalem. But I also wanted to kind of encourage everyone that when we get all worried, as we're concerned for Israel about, we're giving up on our rights to this, or they're dividing up this, or the other side is going to get that this is all part of the prophecies. We can comfort ourselves, even if a negative prophecy is coming true, it comforts us that the Bible is real. So in the book of Joel, in chapter 4, there's the first two verses of chapter 4. For behold, in those days at that time, when I will bring back the captivity, meaning the exiles of Judah and Jerusalem, so that's nowadays, I will gather all the nations and I will take them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will execute justice with them regarding my people, my inheritance Israel, whom they dispersed among the nations, and they divided my land. They divided my land. So first of all, again, putting us back into the historical viewpoint of the people who hear this prophecy, lands weren't chopped up by nations.
They were conquered, and I think part of what's interesting there is that even today, those who want to divide the land don't want to take it. They want to divide it and give it to somebody else.
Yeah, they want to chop it up, right? Because no one's interested in dividing lands. They're interested in conquering them. And here's this prophecy, again, a verse that for many centuries was quite cryptic, and to us it makes perfect sense. And what's also interesting is that this judgment takes place in the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Now, if you go back even 150 or 200 years ago, the Valley of Jehoshaphat is just this valley outside the walls of the city of Jerusalem, kind of the beginning of the hills that run off towards the west or the northwest of the old city. And today, you look at the Valley of Jehoshaphat and you say, wait a second, that's actually part of the actual armistice line between the state of Israel and the Jordanians, and with the Obama administration declaring everything from the 67 lines to be Palestinian territory. That's actually where the Valley of Jehoshaphat runs along that armistice line. So it's another one of these things that makes us realize that, hey, maybe as things progress, we're understanding these verses pretty well. Now, the other thing I wanted to share is last time you talked about how the Palestinians kind of blew it with their relationship with the Emirates.
Yes.
Yeah, about that aid that was given and how they
dissed them. Yeah, they dissed them.
Yeah, they dissed them, and that's probably part of what was going on here. And this weekend, in the in the most widely read Hebrew Israeli newspaper, Yediot Achronot, which both you and I have at our homes over the weekend. In the weekend paper, in the weekend magazine section, which has a lot of political analysis, there was an interview with the deputy foreign minister of the United Arab Emirates, he was really the central figure in this relationship with Israel over the last couple of years. And in the interview, I just wanted to, obviously it's in Hebrew, so I'm just going to do a free translation of one paragraph of the interview, which kind of confirmed what you were saying, but it also took it to another level. Let me just read this here for you.
Okay.
So the interviewer asks him, forgive me for taking off my glasses for a moment. He said, the peace agreement between Israel and you, meaning the Emirates, changed the paradigm. In the past, the assumption was that there must be peace with the Palestinians and then the rest of the Arab world. And you have changed this. And he answers, he says, yes, we made an independent decision without consulting with anyone else in the region. The idea that the Palestinians need to make peace and that we'll follow them would be able to work. That would work if only they were unified. But when there's a problem with organizations such as Hamas, and on the background of this lack of agreements that we had, meaning lack of agreements is a very pleasant way of putting it, that we had with the Palestinian Authority, we understood that we have to move forward. We have a real problem with the corruption of the Palestinian Authority, specifically in light of our being generous donors, or he says extremely generous donors, who want to support the Palestinian population and not the corruption. So instead of donating more and more, we decided to think of a new route, and maybe this agreement will wake them up. Now,
wow.
I read that. Yeah, you see, you just said wow. To get Elliot Chodoff to say wow is no small thing. I just want to elaborate on your wow, because I know you and I are thinking the same thing. When I read this on Shabbat, I was like, whoa, wait a second. It's not just that this is in the background. The fact that the deputy foreign minister of the Emirates is willing to say publicly there's a problem with Hamas and there's corruption in the Palestinian Authority, even American administrations until the Trump administration, and this includes the Bush administration, includes the Clinton administration, even U.S. administrations have never been willing to
call it out.
To openly say there is a problem of corruption of the Palestinian Authority. There's a problem of the division between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, which means that there's no unity there and there's no one to talk to. One of the big issues we always have with the Palestinians is that people on the left who say, oh, give them a state. It's like, give who a state? There's Hamas and there's the Palestinian Authority, and
and there's the PLO and there's Fatah and.
Sure. So the fact that he was willing to call this out and say very plainly, we're interested in helping the people. The Palestinian Authority is corrupt and we don't want to deal with them. And we're looking for a new way of helping them. This, to me, it not only confirmed what you were saying, but it took it to another level, that this paradigm shift is really happening.
Well, you know what? If I could break down what he said versus against what actually happened, they sent aid to Gaza. We permitted it to land, and Hamas refused to accept it. So who's the facilitator and who's the preventer?
Right, exactly. Right.
So
that's a good way to put it.
They're not stupid. They're like, the Israelis are willing to be helpful, and the Palestinian leadership is not. Maybe we've got this backwards.
Okay, so speaking of Hamas in Gaza, they've been in the news this week. So, so what are your thoughts there?
Well, we've got about 2 weeks of escalation going on now, with rocket fire and all sorts of other stuff. And frankly, it's something that I think that we need to watch. I mean, I keep an eye on it, and both through the news and through contacts, but it isn't a lot to really discuss.
Really? What do you mean?
It's a concern, but this is sort of the summer heat up. It happens almost every year. It happens for various reasons having to do with Hamas and its opponents and all sorts of stuff like that. But there's nothing new in this.
Meaning if it's allergy season and your allergies flare up, that's not a health problem that's worth investigating.
Well, I'll take it further. If it's flu season and people are getting really sick, it's important to address it on the operational level, but there isn't a deep commentary here. The weather turns, the flu comes out, people get sick from it.
So in the summer, Hamas gets active in the summertime.
Right. And again, there are a whole bunch of reasons. Maybe we can get to them, but none of them are acute in the sense of they're new to the third week or the fourth week of August 2020.
So they don't signal anything deeper that requires any real, it's just headlines. It's
right.
not
Look,
really.
It could erupt. I don't think it will. It could. It could erupt from things that have nothing to do with intention. Look, a rocket hit a home in Sderot the other night. Iron Dome took out all but one, and the one hit a home. Some of the balloon incendiaries landed in an empty nursery school. Had it been filled with kids, I mean, it's volatile. But hey, that's how we live here. That's not. That's not 2020 news, and it's not news for the last 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. This is the chronic situation. So I think that rather than just go back over it, I think we need to come up to it. And where we left off, so to speak, a few weeks ago, promising to get back to it and then getting preempted by Beirut.
By an explosion in Beirut and a major paradigm shift in the Middle East, right?
I think is to go back to where we were, follow the Iran-Hezbollah track more or less up to date, and then we'll cycle back and follow the Palestinian element of it, which includes Hamas. Of course, there's dovetailing in all of that. But when we stopped last time talking about Hezbollah, last time meaning like 3 weeks ago.
3 episodes ago, yeah.
Basically, Ehud Barak had been elected. He'd been elected on a platform that we would be out of Lebanon within a year. This was July 1999.
Right, and there was the popular mothers protest.
The 4 mothers and a whole pile on. We got to get out of Lebanon. We got to get out of Lebanon. Now, the truth is that the army in those days was also discussing a paradigm shift in Lebanon. But just to remind people and to sort of set the stage, we had a proxy ally in Lebanon. I say proxy ally because they were doing stuff certainly for their own benefit as well, an organization called the South Lebanese Army. It was made up of village militias all through the South. And I'm pretty sure I mentioned this, it's worth repeating, Christian, Muslim, Shiite Muslim, who were all interested in keeping their villages clean. These are people who lived under Palestinian terrorism for decades, and they didn't want it.
Okay, so could you explain the relationship between the South Lebanese Army and Israel? Because despite the name South Lebanese Army, people should understand this is not an army that represented Lebanon.
Correct. As I said, it was a conglomerate of village militias. We had basically worked out with them. This is worth going back a bit. When we first went into Lebanon in 1982, the Israeli army was welcomed by the villagers in the south and in other parts of the country as liberators, liberating them from the Palestinian terrorist organizations. People were dancing in the streets. They were throwing flowers and rice at the Israeli vehicles. I mean, it was a celebration. What was missed, and this was a major Israeli mistake at the time, and by the way, it's a recurring one. We're not the first nor the last to have made this mistake, is that you go from liberator to occupier very, very quickly. Mm. And just because they loved you yesterday doesn't mean they're going to love you tomorrow. It's like, okay, you did the job, you cleaned them out, thank you very much, goodbye. And we overstayed our welcome and made a number of mistakes along the way, in part because it was not a planned occupation in the sense of there was never any intention to turn that territory into Israeli in any way, shape, or form. It was for purely military reasons. Fast forward to the 1990s, basically having learned the lesson, we left the villages in nominal control of the villagers to the extent that they had their own militias. We armed them, we trained them, we paid for a good deal of them, but we respected them as well. In other words, we didn't come through the villages as the army, hey, we're here, we're just coming through. We'd ask permission, they would always say yes. In other words, it was a it wasn't an equal relationship, but it was a much more respectful relationship. And they had their interests. And we supplied them heavily. We supplied them with tanks, with heavy weapons, and provided them with air and artillery support when they needed it, as well as having our forces strung out in the territory between the villages and in outposts along the northern edge of what we called then the security zone, and which I've always called the insecurity zone. Now, the security zone was a problem from a tactical point of view, because when you're sitting in one place, an enemy that figures it out, and Hezbollah did figure it out by the early mid-90s, begins to take the initiative against you. Sitting in one place is a bad thing. And my military students and some of my college students who've taken those kind of courses with me know that one of my iron laws, and I've got a number of them, is he who sets the pace wins the battle. If you're sitting and he's setting the pace, he will win. And our sitting there in and of itself was problematic. The roads leading up to supply and resupply and reinforce the outpost became very dangerous, easily ambushed and so on. We had tragedies as a result of that. There was the helicopter crash in the late 90s. 73 soldiers were killed when 2 helicopters crashed on their way up to Lebanon. Why were they using helicopters? Because the roads were unsafe. Mm. So this is something the Army understood. And one of the discussions in the Army was, okay, what do we do about it? And one of the solutions that was sort of being leaned towards was to withdraw the outposts and not control the territory, leave the SLA in place so they would control the villages, and we would continue to operate in Lebanon without physically sitting there. In other words, sending forces in and out, night, day, ambushes, patrols, whatever, in a strategy that is best described as denying the territory to Hezbollah rather than controlling it ourselves. Okay, denial is a sort of a lower level of control than control itself.
That's also putting a lot of trust in the South Lebanese army.
They had an interest. They had an interest. And we could have continued to support them with artillery. We could have continued to support them with air support, and if necessary, with physical support on the ground, if necessary, because we have the vehicles to get in there. Not instantaneously, but soon enough in case they came under heavy attack. Ehud Barak's strategy, if you can call it that, was based on a principle, and I call it the Barak Doctrine. In Hebrew, it's called Anachnu kan vehem sham. We're here and they're there. We're going to pull back across the line. It's not really a border, but we're going to pull back out of their territory. We're going to withdraw all support for the SLA. And we're going to be on our side. They're going to be on their side. We won't bother them. They will have no reason to bother us. And life will be beautiful. Peace in our time in the Middle East. Now, the most fundamental problem with that plan is that Ehud Barak we're talking about, didn't read the large print in the Hezbollah doctrine. Not the small print, the large print. Number one objective of Hezbollah is to destroy Israel. They make no bones about it. It's based on Khomeini's philosophy. They repeat it all the time. And I don't know where he came up with this idea that it was all about our being in Lebanon. They wanted us out of Lebanon for sure, but that wasn't their objective. That wasn't their grand objective. So when we pulled back, when we pulled out, Hezbollah moved in. Now, in withdrawing support from the SLA collapsed.
Wow, and they must have been treated like traitors by Hezbollah.
Well, actually, what happened is much more complex and more interesting than that. Hezbollah began, Barak said, we're going to be out in a year. In other words, he came in July. We're going to be out in July of 2000. Now, here's another very important rule. Never tell your enemy what you plan to do. It's not that complicated. And Hezbollah, correctly from their perspective, said, why should we let them out in July if we can drive them out earlier and make it look like a victory? So they started putting pressure on the South Lebanese army. And the SLA, South Lebanese army, knowing that it was going to be abandoned, basically collapsed in late April and early May of 2000, leaving our outposts completely exposed. So in a very, very quickly thrown together operation, although it was well planned, quickly thrown together on the operational level, we pulled out essentially in one night in May 2000. And I would argue tactically, in the grand scheme of things, it was one of the most brilliantly executed operations in IDF history. Just to give you a quick sense of it, we pulled everybody out basically in one night. We lost nobody. And when I say lost, I mean it in both senses of the term. Nobody got killed and nobody got lost. And anybody who's ever traveled with a bunch of people, and I'm talking about, a busload of 20, 30 people for a week, not losing anybody is quite a feat. Not losing anybody in a withdrawal operation at night is semi-miraculous. And by the way, an organized withdrawal, is an extremely complex operation because you're going in the wrong direction. Okay, and an advance may be difficult, but it's easily kind of layered. A withdrawal is not, and this was done under fire, because once they realized what was happening, they opened fire on our troops. And one of the ways not to have a withdrawal break down is that you don't return fire. This is not a simple thing to do when you're under fire and you're combat troops. But if you do return fire, first of all, it gives away your position. And second, parts of the withdrawal will become engaged. So instead of think of a balloon collapsing on itself neatly, parts of the balloon will get stuck. Okay. And you can have units trapped that way, surrounded. In other words, it becomes a real merry mess. So
now, without going, Elliot, just without going into details,
yes,
you were serving during this time, right?
Yes, I was.
So, okay. You were, okay. So in other words, you have firsthand knowledge of what happened here.
Yeah, I was actually attached at the time to the Chief Infantry Paratroop Officers headquarters.
Okay.
Dealing in doctrine. So on the one hand, as I said, brilliant. On the other hand, to paraphrase Churchill after Dunkirk, when the word of Dunkirk, the success at Dunkirk, was relayed to the House of Commons, it was given a standing ovation, and Churchill, in his inimitable fashion, got up and said, "May I remind the members of this House that wars are not won by spectacular retreats." Now, with the collapse of the SLA, 8,000 Lebanese crossed into Israel with us at the same time. They fled.
They were fearing for their lives.
Fearing for their lives. And we
was that anticipated? Was that anticipated by us?
Nothing was anticipated. That was the whole point. In other words, it happened so fast in May that there was no negotiation. We brought them in. They left their cars at the border. They came across on foot. We set them up initially in camps, and then very, very quickly moved them to hotels. There were still a couple of them, not too many left, a bunch of holiday villages along the shores of the Sea of Galilee. They were sort of like bungalow colonies, and they were very quickly turned into refugee centers. They weren't refugee camps in the sense that people would imagine. They were living in structures, and they were being taken care of, and that sort of thing. But basically, it was, okay, now what do we do with these 8,000 people? And by the way, it had its own complexity. We couldn't mix Christian with Muslim villages. We couldn't mix Druze with Muslim with Christian village. I mean, even though they were all serving in the SLA, the villages had their own animosity between them.
Probably goes back, I don't know, about like 1,000 years or something.
Yeah, exactly. So it was an interesting period in its own right. Since then, some have stayed here. Some have gone back, and this is part of the interesting part. Hezbollah made a point of not taking revenge against them. And that was part of Hezbollah's political movement to get to where it is today as a major political power in Lebanon, supported by some of the Christian parties. In other words, Nasrallah and the Hezbollah leadership behaved extremely highly strategically during that period. And at the same time, the Christians basically had fled the south. Those who didn't were driven out of the south. The south that used to be very largely Christian during the period that we were there now has become entirely Shiite Muslim and entirely Hezbollah land. During that summer of 2000, Nasrallah made a speech in Bin Jebel, one of the major cities in the south, that we refer to as the spiderweb speech, where he said the Israeli army is a myth. It's not really a powerful army. It's a spider web. All you have to do is this, and it disappears. We, Barak, in May, June, made multiple statements saying, okay, we're back across the border. We're here. You're there. You're not going to bother us. We're not going to bother you. But if anything happens across this border, we're going to respond with extreme violence. Okay, deterrence is in place. And then early in the fall, a war breaks out with the Palestinians that they launch, what is commonly referred to as the Second Intifada, but which is not an intifada. An intifada is a popular uprising. This is a terrorist war that arced upward into 2001 and 2002. We'll talk about that in its own context. But that's the period of the suicide bombings and ultimately operations in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. While all of that is going on, the military units that were supposed to be holding the northern border get stripped from the border and sent into the territories. And from September, October 2000 until September 2005, the northern border was not held by Israeli infantry. It was held by other troops, very good boys and girls, but not people whose training is about holding and controlling territory. Engineers, tankists pressed into infantry service. In other words, not tanks, guys from the tanks operating as foot soldiers. And I hesitate to call them infantry because they were operating as infantry, but not trained as infantry. And the border was basically abandoned. In that fall, there was the attack in which 3 Israeli soldiers were killed and their bodies were taken. The first so-called kidnapping. And by the way, here I have to say, I don't use the word kidnapping. Gilad Shalit wasn't kidnapped. The soldiers in 2006 weren't kidnapped. Soldiers serving in the line in uniform are not kidnapped. They're not victims of a crime. Now, that doesn't mean what that would happen to them should have happened to them. But when you're on patrol or on duty on a hostile border, it's your job to prevent that from happening. Nobody else is going to do that for you. But in any event, there was no real response to that. Some 24 Israelis were killed along that border between 2000 and 2006. And it was kept quiet, largely because the Israeli government knew that if it said or did anything about it, it would have to respond, and it didn't have the capability because of what was going on in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. And here it's no secret. We see that today, and maybe we'll conclude with this and pick up the next time. We see it today. The closer anything happens to the center of the country, meaning Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, the more seriously it's taken by the decision makers. So rockets around the south or fire along the northern border gets much less serious attention then rockets into Tel Aviv or attacks around Jerusalem. And that was part of the reality. I actually wrote an article back then, 2003 or so, 2002, 2003, called Ignoring the North, in which I can't say I predicted in the prophetic sense, but predicted what was ultimately going to happen in 2006. Because if you ignore it long enough, they're going to cross the line and force you not to ignore it.
Right. This sounds like a good place to stop. It's interesting that as you're talking, and I'm thinking about what I started with the comments of the Deputy Foreign Minister of the UAE about the Palestinians, that it seems that the Palestinians were in a much stronger position diplomatically and in terms of geopolitically back then than they are today.
Yes.
And maybe, with the words of this Deputy Foreign Minister, maybe it's time for them to wake up, and maybe there could be a better life for them. But I think it's important that whatever happens in the news this week, Elliot, that next week we pick this up, because the story, this is the real type of background information that people need. When we watch the news, we just get the moment without the perspective, and this is really giving us the perspective. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. Elliot, you wanted to say something?
No, just hopefully nothing that exciting will happen in the next week.
You never know.
You never know.
You never know. You never know. We'll see what happens out there in the Persian Gulf or with Iran or in Syria. There's always fun. Okay, everyone, have a great week, and we'll talk to you again a week from now. Please share this. Please keep the comments coming. David Naring, who commented that he'd like to see us go back and pick up some of the loose ends. That's exactly what we're doing this week. We saw your comment. We plan to do that anyway, but it is important to talk about the latest developments as well when they matter. So thank you for watching Israel Matters, where we discuss the things that matter most to Israel. God bless.